The audacity of my son-in-law, Scott, was on full display at the Thanksgiving dinner table. He stood in front of my entire family and called me worthless trash, certain he could get away with it. But his cruel words, which were meant to break me, actually came back to haunt him the very next day. He had no idea that his life was about to be changed forever by 3 simple messages. One from me, one from my lawyer, and one from the bank. The betrayal I felt in that moment unexpectedly led me to seek a kind of justice that no one saw coming. My daughter, Lisa, sat across the dining room table from me, her voice cracking as she pleaded that I couldn't simply cut them off. Her fork made a loud noise as it fell against her china plate. The half-eaten turkey on the table was now cold and unappetizing. Scott leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine with an air of deliberate arrogance. He insisted we had a deal, a promise of $3,000 every month, and he claimed my daughter, Lisa, had been relying on that money. I slowly and carefully put down my carving knife, and the other family members around the table shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable. I noticed my sister, Susan, sharing a worried look with her husband, Mark. Scott's brother, Kevin, stopped in the middle of a mouthful, while his wife, Jessica, reached for her water glass, her fingers trembling. I spoke softly, clarifying that there had been no formal agreement. I simply helped them because I had wanted to. Scott's laugh was sharp and full of bitterness. He asked if I considered what I was doing to be help, accusing me of abandoning my own daughter and causing her to struggle. His words lingered in the air like smoke. I watched as new tears began to stream down Lisa's cheeks, leaving dark trails of mascara. She seemed to be caught in the middle of a fight she never wanted to have, looking back and forth between her husband and me. My voice was calm even as I felt a fire rising inside me. I reminded everyone that I had raised 5 children after my wife, Eleanor, had passed away, and that I had put all of them through college. I had also purchased this house so that our family would always have a place to come together. Scott interrupted, waving his hand dismissively as he called my efforts ancient history. He insisted that the present was what mattered, that my daughter needed my support, and that I was too selfish to give it to her. A deep silence fell over the room, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mark nervously cleared his throat, and Kevin moved the food around on his plate, carefully avoiding my gaze. I repeated the word selfish to myself. It felt so wrong. Scott's chair scraped loudly across the floor as he stood up. The wine he had been drinking had clearly made him reckless and brazen. His face was flushed as he pointed a finger at me across the mahogany table my late wife, Eleanor, had chosen 30 years ago. He accused me of being selfish, claiming that I hoarded my money in this large house while my own daughter struggled to pay her mortgage, working double shifts just to feed herself. My jaw tightened. I thought about how Lisa only worked part-time at a boutique, but Scott wasn't interested in the details. He slammed his wine glass down so forcefully that its stem cracked and dark red wine bled into the white tablecloth. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper as he insisted that family should take care of family. Then he called me worthless trash, adding that my wife had deserved a better father for our daughter. The room erupted with gasps. My sister, Susan, put her hand over her mouth. Jessica knocked over her water glass, sending ice cubes scattering across the table. Finally, Kevin looked up, his eyes wide with shock. But I felt something different, something cold and calculated settling deep inside me, like a winter frost. The anger I should have felt never came. Instead, a strange sense of calm came over me, giving me a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I stood up slowly, and my napkin fell to the floor. Every eye in the room was on me, waiting for the explosion that would never happen. Scott took a step back, maybe realizing he had gone too far. I simply announced that dinner was over. The words were so final that everyone flinched. Lisa started to say something, but I held up my hand. It was not a rude gesture, but a decisive one. It was the movement of a man who had already made up his mind. As I walked toward my study, I heard chairs scraping and whispered conversations starting up behind me. I stopped at the door without turning around and quietly asked Kevin to help his family gather their things. Behind me, Scott was already arguing with Lisa in harsh whispers about not letting an old man push him around, but his voice no longer sounded confident. It was hollow now and desperate. I closed the door to my study and walked over to my desk. Through the window, I could see the warm light spilling from my neighbor's house. I imagined another family in there, probably sharing pie and watching football, completely oblivious to the fact that lives were being permanently altered just next door. My fingers found the brass handle on my desk drawer, the one where I kept all my financial records. 3 months of withdrawn support, $850,000 in savings, and 45 years of business experience were all at my disposal. Scott had just made the biggest mistake of his life. 2 hours later, I turned off the dining room lights. The broken wine glass had left a permanent stain on Eleanor's favorite tablecloth. I wrapped the leftover turkey and put away the dishes, moving through the house with a mechanical precision. My study felt smaller tonight, and my mahogany desk, usually a sanctuary for me, seemed weighed down by Scott's words. Worthless trash. I pulled out my chair and sat down heavily, looking at the photograph of Eleanor that had sat on my desk for 12 years, watching over my work. I told her smiling face that I had kept my promise. The desk drawer opened with a familiar creak, revealing 12 years of financial records. Each year was labeled in my neat handwriting and organized in manila folders. From December 2012 to November 2024, the story of my sacrifices was documented in bank statements and canceled checks. I took out my old Texas Instruments calculator, the same one I had used for my business deals for decades. The numbers told a cold, hard truth. $3,000 every month for 12 years. My fingers moved over the keys with practiced ease, and I calculated that the base payments alone added up to $432,000. But that was not all. I opened a red folder that contained all the extras. $8,000 for a new transmission for Scott's Honda. $12,000 for Lisa's surgery when their insurance fell short. $5,000 for the down payment on their current home. And $4,000 for Scott's certification program that never led to the promotion he had promised. Each receipt told the same story. Just this once? Or we'll pay you back. And this will be the last time we need help. The lies piled up like dust on old, forgotten furniture. Next, I opened the folder titled Conversations. I had a habit of documenting important family discussions for business, and my late wife, Eleanor, had taught me that while memory was unreliable, written records never lied. The first note was dated December 15, 2012. I remember Lisa's voice breaking with tears as she explained that Scott was trying to find steady work and asked if I could help them with rent until he was established. The note from March 3, 2015, recalled Scott's confident tone as he insisted that his promotion was practically guaranteed and that they would be independent within 6 months. The one from August 12, 2018 was from Lisa again, explaining that the housing market is crazy and that Scott was working on something big at his company. The last entry was from October 4, 2021, and recalled Scott's irritated tone as he told me they were adults who appreciated my help but did not need lectures about budgeting. The entries went on and on, each one a small betrayal wrapped up in family obligation. Broken promises, ignored deadlines, and a sense of gratitude that was slowly but surely replaced with a sense of entitlement. I closed my eyes, and my thoughts drifted back to that December morning when Eleanor's breathing grew shallow. She had gripped my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail and whispered for me to promise her that I would take care of our girl. She knew that Lisa would need guidance because she was too trusting and too generous with her heart. I had promised her right away, without any hesitation. How could I have done otherwise? But Eleanor never said anything about taking care of Scott. The calculator's display glowed in the light of the lamp, showing that I had spent nearly $500,000, which was more than most people earned in a decade. It was more than I had ever spent on anything except for this house. I leaned back in the leather chair Eleanor had surprised me with for my 50th birthday. It was the same chair where I had built my construction business from a small loan and turned it into a company that employed 37 people. It was where I had negotiated contracts worth millions. It was where I had learned that a successful man doesn't get mad, he gets strategic. Scott had called me worthless trash in front of my family, in my own house and at my own table. He had forgotten that trash was something you got rid of. But whether I was worthless or not remained to be seen. I reached for my phone and scrolled through the contacts I hadn't called in months. They were old business associates, legal professionals, and others who understood that every problem had a solution if you knew how to approach it correctly. Tomorrow would be a very different day. Dawn was just beginning to peek through my study windows when I pushed aside my financial records. My coffee had been cold for hours, but I was too wired to sleep. The house felt different now, filled with purpose instead of emptiness. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my file cabinet, a place I rarely looked at anymore. Inside, legal documents from my years in business were organized in hanging folders. I found property deeds, contract templates, and partnership agreements, and then, in the folder labeled Family Legal, I found what I was searching for. The mortgage papers from 2016. Scott's signature was scrawled across the bottom of page 12, looking both confident and careless. But above it, in the guarantor section, my name was written in careful block letters. I remembered that day so clearly. Lisa had begged me to co-sign because Scott's credit wasn't quite good enough for their dream house. She had said it was just as a backup, and that they would never need me to actually pay anything. 8 years later, I realized what Scott had forgotten, and what he had perhaps never understood. I didn't just guarantee their mortgage. I owned 30% of their house. My business experience kicked in like muscle memory. Property law was simple if you understood the basics. As a guarantor with a share of ownership, I had the legal right to demand that any debts be settled immediately. I could force a sale or I could call the loan. Scott had no idea. I picked up my address book, a leather-bound volume that had survived 3 decades of business deals. The card for my lawyer, Michael Hayes, was tucked right where I had left it, between the pages. He had been my lawyer for 15 years, handling my company's contracts and helping me sort out Eleanor's estate after her passing. At exactly 7 a.m., I dialed his direct number. He answered professionally. I told him I was David, and that I needed his legal expertise for a family matter. His voice immediately became warmer. He asked me how I was holding up and said he knew the holidays could be difficult without Eleanor. I told him I was doing well, but had a situation involving my daughter's mortgage that needed immediate attention. The line was silent for a moment before he switched back to his professional tone and asked me what kind of situation it was. I explained that I had co-signed and held a share of ownership in a property, and that the main borrowers had become financially irresponsible and disrespectful in public. I told him I wanted to understand all of my legal options. He made a quiet sound of understanding and asked when I could come in, suggesting that it was something we should discuss in person. I told him I could be there that morning if possible. He said to give him an hour to review property law precedents and asked if I could be there by 9. I glanced at my watch and knew I had 2 hours to shower, get dressed, and get my documents together. I told him I would be there. He then told me to bring all the original paperwork, including the mortgage documents, any payment records, and any correspondence regarding the loan. I told him I had already gathered it all. A note of concern entered his voice as he asked if I was certain this was the path I wanted to take, explaining that family legal matters could get complicated. I looked at Eleanor's photograph and then at the pile of financial records that documented 12 years of my one-sided generosity. I reminded him that my son-in-law had called me worthless trash in front of my entire family in my own home yesterday. Silence filled the line for a few seconds before he quietly told me he would see me at 9. After hanging up, I sat in my chair for a long moment, watching the city of Spokane wake up outside my window. I imagined early commuters heading to their jobs, working for people who respected them. They were just normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that a few blocks away, a plan for revenge was being carefully prepared. I finally stood up and walked to my bedroom to get dressed. Today called for my best suit. The elevator chimed softly, and I found myself on the 12th floor of the Paulson Center. Michael Hayes's law office occupied the corner suite, and I could see all of downtown Spokane through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I had been in this office dozens of times over the years, but today was different. I wasn't here as a businessman seeking contract advice. Michael greeted me at his office door, his silver hair perfectly styled. We had known each other long enough that we did not need to shake hands. He studied my face, paused, and told me I looked determined. I confirmed that I was. His conference room smelled of leather and old law books, and I spread my documents across the mahogany table. I had brought the mortgage papers, property deeds, guarantor agreements, and 12 years of payment records. Michael first picked up the mortgage document, and his experienced eyes scanned the legal language. He noted that I had co-signed on their house on Miller Avenue back in 2016 and had a 30% share of ownership. He recalled the banker explaining my rights back then, but acknowledged that I had not paid attention to the details because I never intended to exercise them. His finger traced the guarantor clause as he told me that I had a lot of legal power in this situation. As a co-owner and guarantor, I could demand immediate payment of any outstanding debts that were secured by the property. A cold satisfaction washed over me as he explained. I asked him what kind of debts he meant. He said that it included the mortgage balance, home equity loans, and any credit accounts that were using the property as collateral. He looked up from the documents to ask me if I had checked their current financial status. I told him that was my next stop. He leaned back in his chair, and his expression changed from professional to concerned. He told me that he had known me since Eleanor was alive and that this was not like me. I admitted that what happened yesterday wasn't like me either, and I explained that Scott had made it very clear how he viewed our relationship. He asked me what Scott had said, and I met his gaze steadily, telling him that my son-in-law had called me worthless trash in front of my family in my own home. Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He said he understood and asked if I wanted to respond using legal channels. I told him I just wanted to respond appropriately. At 1:30 that afternoon, I sat across from Victoria Stone in the Customer Relations Office of First National Bank. She had managed commercial accounts for 15 years and immediately recognized my name when I called. She saw that I was listed as a co-owner of the Miller Avenue property and asked me how she could help. I slid the property documents across her desk and told her I needed to see the financial status of all the accounts associated with the address. Her fingers clicked on her keyboard with professional efficiency, and her expression remained neutral, but I noticed her eyes widen slightly when the information came up on her screen. She told me that the primary account holder was Scott, and that the current mortgage balance was $218,000, and the home equity loan balance was $47,000. She paused, scrolling down to tell me that there were also 3 credit accounts that were using the property as collateral. I asked her for the total amount of credit card debt, and she said that it was $34,000 across multiple accounts. She paused again to review the payment history and told me that it showed consistent late payments over the past 18 months, with 2 of the accounts currently in default. I felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in my mind. Scott's arrogance was funded by debt he couldn't handle, and his comfortable lifestyle was built on borrowed money he had no way of repaying. Victoria chose her words carefully as she explained my options. She told me I had the legal right to demand payment resolution. She explained that if the primary borrower could not meet those obligations, I could initiate foreclosure proceedings or force the sale of the property. The timeline was simple. I had to give a 30-day written notice to the borrower, and if no resolution was reached, legal action could begin immediately after. I thanked her and gathered my documents. The drive home was different from the trip downtown. My briefcase now held not just old papers, but legal weapons that Scott had unknowingly handed to me. The sun was setting as I pulled into my driveway. It was Friday, and I had the entire weekend to prepare the next phase. Scott had called me worthless trash on Thursday. By the following Friday, he would fully understand the true value of his family's security. That Friday evening, I cleared my entire desk and started over, organizing every document. Property deeds went in one stack, financial records in another, and legal precedents in a third. My study was no longer just an office. It had become a kind of war room. I made 3 lists on a yellow legal pad: what I knew, what I suspected, and what I needed to prove. The list of suspicions was the longest. Scott's lifestyle never quite matched his salary, even with my monthly help. He had expensive dinners, the newest phones, and went on weekend trips that Lisa would mention casually. I had assumed he was just bad with money, but what if it was more than just irresponsibility? On Saturday morning, I called my lawyer, Michael, at home. I told him I needed a recommendation for a private investigator, someone discreet. When he asked what kind of investigation it was, I told him I needed a financial background check specifically for gambling and hidden debts. He paused for a moment before recommending James Connor, a former detective. He promised to text me his number. I met James Connor at his office in a converted warehouse downtown. He was younger than I expected, maybe 52, but he had the sharp eyes of a person who had seen too much of human nature. He told me Michael had explained my situation and asked if I suspected financial impropriety by a family member. I slid the basic information on my son-in-law across his desk and told him I needed to know everything about his financial activities over the past 18 months, specifically gambling, among other things. James quoted his fees and gave me a timeline of 48 hours for a comprehensive report that would be legal and admissible in court. On Sunday morning, James called me before I had finished my coffee and told me I needed to see his findings in person. His report was 11 pages long. It detailed Scott's online poker activities, sports betting, and casino games dating back 22 months. He had daily sessions averaging 2 to 4 hours. The numbers made my stomach turn. James pointed to a spreadsheet and explained that Scott had $28,000 in gambling losses over the past 18 months. He had a hidden bank account that my daughter knew nothing about and 3 secret credit cards. James said that Scott had been diverting approximately 40% of his salary, and that the gambling had increased dramatically after I stopped my monthly payments. He had been using credit to maintain the lifestyle my support had previously funded. I studied the transaction patterns and realized Scott wasn't just irresponsible with money. He was addicted to losing it. James continued by telling me there was more: 2 payday loans that were both overdue, as well as a personal loan from his brother, Kevin, that he had never mentioned to my daughter. The total hidden debt was nearly $55,000. I felt a chill spread through the room. Scott had not just insulted me. He had been systematically deceiving Lisa while living off my generosity. James pulled out one final document and said he had found evidence that Scott had been researching bankruptcy law, that he had downloaded several guides and visited attorney websites. He was planning to default on everything. That evening, I sat in my study with all the evidence laid out before me. Scott's financial life was completely exposed. I had found his gambling addiction, his deception of Lisa, and his complete dependency on credit and other people's money. He had called me worthless trash while secretly planning to destroy my daughter's financial future. I opened my laptop and began typing. I would send 3 documents, 3 messages, that would arrive Monday morning at precisely calculated intervals. Each one would strip away another layer of Scott's false sense of security until he understood exactly how powerless he really was. The first message would go to Scott at 9 a.m., the second to the bank at 11, and the third would wait until Scott came crawling to me, begging for mercy he had never shown. At 8 a.m. Monday morning, I sat at my desk with coffee cooling beside 3 printed documents. The first was personal, the others were business. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Scott. "Don't contact trash again. Check your mail." I hit send. The message was delivered immediately. Scott would read those words and remember exactly what he had called me 5 days ago. At 8:15, my phone rang. It was Michael. He was already prepared to execute the eviction notice. Certified mail would go out that morning, and he was sending an email copy as well. I opened my laptop and forwarded his email to myself, then printed the legal notice. It stated that Scott had 30 days to vacate. The words "property co-owner" were clearly stated on the official law firm letterhead. It contained everything Scott had never bothered to understand about his own mortgage. At 8:30, I dialed Victoria Stone. I told her I was requesting an immediate debt acceleration on the Miller Avenue property. She assured me that as a co-owner, I had that authority and that they would send demand letters for all outstanding balances that day. She told me the total was $34,000, plus interest, and that payment was due in 10 days. 3 strikes: a personal message, a legal one, and a financial one. Scott would spend his morning discovering that his comfortable life had been built on sand and that the tide was coming in. I returned to my coffee and waited. The phone rang at 11:07 a.m. It was my daughter, Lisa. Her voice was barely recognizable through her sobs. She said that Scott had received some papers that morning and was completely losing his mind. There was something about an eviction, and the bank was calling about immediate payment. She said she didn't understand what was going on. I asked her what Scott had told her. She said he wouldn't tell her anything, that he just kept saying it was impossible and that I couldn't do this, that there had to be a mistake. Her voice cracked as she begged me to tell her what was happening. I asked her if she remembered Thanksgiving dinner. She asked what that had to do with anything. I reminded her that her husband had called me worthless trash in front of our entire family. A long silence stretched across the line. When she spoke again, her voice was much smaller. She admitted that Scott had been wrong to say that, but pleaded that I couldn't just throw them out of their house with those legal papers. I calmly told her that I could, explaining that I owned 30% of her house and had guaranteed her mortgage when Scott's credit wasn't good enough. Something he had apparently forgotten to mention when he decided to insult me. She asked if I really owned part of her house. I told her to read the mortgage papers because my name was right there next to his. The crying intensified. She insisted that they lived there, that their daughter, Emma, went to school there, and that they couldn't just leave. I told her that was something her husband should have thought about before he decided I was worthless trash. She begged me to stop and said Scott was sorry. I looked at Eleanor's photograph on my desk, remembering how she had taught me that actions have consequences and that respect was earned and lost through choices. I told my daughter to tell Scott that worthless trash had just cut off his financial life support. I hung up and set the phone aside. Through my window, the December rain streamed like tears. Somewhere across town, Scott was discovering that insulting the wrong person could cost him everything. My coffee had long since gone cold, but I felt warmer than I had in years. Tuesday morning brought the first true collapse. Lisa called at 9:15, her voice raw from crying. She told me Scott had lost his job yesterday. He couldn't focus after those legal papers had arrived, had made 3 major mistakes on a client project, and his company had let him go. I sipped my fresh coffee and watched sparrows gather outside my kitchen window. I told her how unfortunate that was. Her voice cracked with disbelief as she reminded me that he had been with that company for 6 years and that they depended on his salary. I told her that her husband had made his choice at Thanksgiving dinner. The line went quiet except for her ragged breathing. She whispered for me to please call Michael and tell him it was all a mistake, and to tell the bank to unfreeze their credit cards so they could work this out. I told her I was afraid that was not possible and hung up, returning to my newspaper. The stock market was performing well, and my portfolio had gained 2% this quarter. Wednesday brought even deeper consequences. Victoria Stone called to confirm that the account freeze was complete and that all credit access was suspended pending debt resolution. She reported with professional efficiency that Scott had attempted to withdraw cash yesterday but was denied. He had requested 3 separate meetings with management, but his deadline remained 10 days. December 12th for the full payment of $34,000, plus interest. Lisa called again that afternoon, more frantic than before. She told me they had frozen everything. Their checking account, savings, and credit cards. She said she couldn't buy groceries today, and that Emma had asked her why she was crying at the store. I thought of my granddaughter, 8 years old, with brown curls just like my late wife, Eleanor. She didn't deserve this chaos, but Scott should have considered his family before insulting mine. I explained to Lisa that these are just standard banking procedures when co-owners requested debt acceleration. She shrieked that I kept saying co-owner like it meant something. I told her that it meant I owned 30% of her house, that I had guaranteed her mortgage when her husband's credit wasn't sufficient, and that it meant I had the legal authority to demand immediate debt satisfaction. She said I was destroying them. I told her that her husband had destroyed himself and that I was simply revealing the destruction. Thursday morning, I was watering Eleanor's orchids when the phone rang again. It was Lisa's number. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. She said, without preamble, that Scott hadn't slept in 3 days and had lost 12 pounds. She said he just sat at the kitchen table, staring at those legal papers like they were written in another language. I suggested that perhaps he should have learned to read before signing mortgage documents. She exploded through the phone, begging me to stop being so cruel. She said that this wasn't me, that this wasn't the man who had raised her. I moved to my study and sat down at the desk where all of this had begun. Eleanor's photograph watched me with gentle eyes. I told Lisa that this was exactly the man who had raised her, and that this was what happened when someone mistook kindness for weakness. She asked me what I wanted from them. I told her I wanted her husband to understand that actions have consequences and that calling someone worthless trash came with a price. She asked if that wasn't what he already understood. I asked if he had called to apologize, or if he had acknowledged that his behavior was unacceptable. Silence stretched between us. She finally admitted that he was too proud to do either. I told her he could be proud in someone else's house. She began to beg me, saying that this was only going to get worse, wasn't it? I looked out my window at the gray December sky, which promised snow. Winter was coming to Spokane, and Scott was about to discover just how cold the world could become. I told Lisa that this was only the beginning. On Saturday morning, the doorbell rang while I was reading the business section. Through the window, I saw Scott's Honda in my driveway. The same car I had helped him repair 3 years ago with an $8,000 loan he had never repaid. Scott stood on my porch, looking like a man who had aged 5 years in 5 days. His clothes hung loosely on his body. His face was drawn and unshaven, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had stopped sleeping. I opened the door wider and gestured for him to follow me to my study. He followed like a condemned man walking to his execution. I settled behind my desk and told him to sit. He remained standing, and I saw his hands shaking. He told me he was wrong and that what he had said at Thanksgiving was completely out of line. He said that I had been so generous to their family for years, and that he had had no right to speak to me that way. I leaned back in my chair and said nothing. He begged me to call off the lawyers and the bank, saying that he would do whatever I wanted but that they couldn't lose their house. He said Lisa was falling apart and Emma kept asking why her mommy cried all the time. I asked him if he understood his legal situation. He swallowed hard and said he knew that I owned a part of their house and that he never would have said what he did if he had known that. I asked him what else he understood. He said the bank wanted $34,000 in 10 days and that he didn't have that kind of money. He said he didn't have any money at all because he had lost his job after my papers had arrived and that everything was falling apart. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a legal pad, then began writing in careful block letters. I told him these were my terms for stopping the legal proceedings. Scott leaned forward eagerly. I told him that first, he would apologize publicly at Christmas dinner in front of every family member who had witnessed his behavior at Thanksgiving. He agreed. Second, he would acknowledge that he had been financially irresponsible and ungrateful for 12 years of my support. His face reddened, but he nodded. Third, he would sign a written agreement never to ask me for financial assistance again. I then told him that fourth, he would publicly state that he had called his wife's father worthless trash and that this was completely unacceptable. Scott stared at me, understanding dawning in his eyes. He realized that I wanted him to humiliate himself in front of everyone. I told him that I wanted him to tell the truth in front of everyone. He said this wasn't about an apology. It was about me breaking him down completely. I set down my pen and looked at him directly. I told him he had had a choice at Thanksgiving dinner and that he had chosen to humiliate me publicly. I told him he now had another choice. Scott stood up slowly, his hands shaking with either exhaustion or rage. He said he would not grovel and that he would not destroy what was left of his dignity just to satisfy my need for revenge. I told him that if he did not agree, he would lose his house. He said maybe, but that he would not let me turn him into something pathetic. He walked to the door and turned back, telling me he was wrong to call me worthless trash, but that he was not sure I was any better than he was. The front door closed behind him with quiet finality. I returned to my desk and pulled out James Connor's detective report. Scott still had some fight left in him, some pride to protect. I decided it was time to take that away, too. On Monday morning, I opened my address book to the section marked Professional Contacts. 35 years of business relationships were spread across 12 pages of carefully maintained connections. I had a long list of IT managers, HR directors, and business owners who had benefited from my referrals or partnerships over the years. I started with my first call to David Wells at Northwest Tech Solutions. I told him I had heard through business circles that Scott might be approaching his company for employment. He checked their applicant database and confirmed that Scott had submitted a resume. He told me that Scott had a strong technical background. I told him that I felt obligated to share some concerns. I told him that Scott had recently been terminated for performance issues related to stress management and that there were also questions about his financial responsibility and judgment under pressure. I told him that I appreciated the heads up and that we would certainly take that into consideration. By noon, I had made 8 similar calls. By Wednesday, Scott had been rejected by every major IT firm in Spokane. Thursday afternoon, Lisa called. She said something was wrong, that Scott had been applying everywhere but that companies kept rejecting him after showing initial interest. She said it was like someone was warning them about him. I sat down my coffee and considered my response carefully. I explained to her that the Spokane business community was quite interconnected, and that word traveled quickly about employment concerns. She asked what kind of concerns, and I told her about Scott's recent termination, his inability to handle pressure, and the legal and financial issues he was currently facing. Her voice dropped to a whisper as she accused me of sabotaging his job search. I told her that I was just providing accurate information to protect other businesses from making poor hiring decisions. She said I was being cruel and reminded me that they needed his income and that Emma needed stability. I told her that Scott needed to accept my terms and that he had chosen pride over practicality. She accused me of destroying them systematically. I told her I was just teaching her husband that actions had consequences. The line went quiet for a long moment before she finally said that she would not let me do this to her family. She said that if I was going to wage war against her husband, then I was also waging war against her. I told her not to say that, but she insisted she was done choosing between us. She said she chose him. The dial tone echoed in my study like a funeral bell. Friday morning brought the final piece. Michael called to confirm that the debt collection lawsuit had been filed. The court date was January 15th, and Scott would be required to appear and explain why he couldn't satisfy the debt obligations. He told me that if the court ruled in our favor, which they would, we could initiate foreclosure proceedings within 30 days. I hung up and walked to my window. Across the street, my neighbor was hanging Christmas lights, preparing for a season of family gatherings and shared traditions. I had lost my daughter, but Scott would lose everything. Sometimes justice required sacrifice. Eleanor had taught me that when she chose to fight her cancer rather than surrender to it. She had lost the battle but had maintained her dignity until the end. Scott would have no such luxury. By Christmas, he would understand exactly what happened when someone called Leonard Green worthless trash. Monday morning brought an unexpected phone call. Martha's name appeared on my caller ID at 7:30, earlier than she had ever called in 15 years. She told me we needed to talk about what I was doing to Scott and Lisa. I sat down my coffee carefully and wished her a good morning. She told me not to use my polite tone, explaining that Lisa had called her yesterday, crying, and that she said I was sabotaging Scott's job search through my business connections. I told her I was just providing accurate employment references to protect other companies from making poor hiring decisions. She accused me of systematically destroying that family, and her voice rose with a fury I had rarely heard from my sister. She said Scott had made a mistake at dinner and that people say stupid things when they are stressed, but that what I was doing was cruel and vindictive. Tuesday, James, Scott's brother, called. He said he knew Scott had been out of line at Thanksgiving but that this had gone too far, and that Scott could not find work anywhere in Spokane and that his family was going to lose their house. I told him Scott should have considered those consequences before insulting me in my own home. He said I was punishing Lisa and Emma for something Scott had done. On Wednesday, my old friend Paul called. He said he had known me for 30 years and that this was not like me, and that Scott had admitted he was wrong and asked if that wasn't enough. I asked him if Scott had apologized to me directly. He said Scott was too proud. I told him that if that was the case, Scott was not sorry enough. On Thursday evening, Christina called, her voice shaking with emotion. She said that she had daughters too and could not imagine watching them suffer because of something their father had said. She begged me to forgive Scott for Emma's sake. Each call felt like water wearing down stone. By Friday, I found myself staring out my study window longer than usual, watching neighbors prepare for Christmas, while my own family prepared for war. I wondered if I had gone too far. Scott's insult had lasted 30 seconds, while my response had been 3 weeks of systematic destruction. But then I remembered his face that Thanksgiving evening, the sneer when he called me worthless trash, and the satisfaction in his voice, as if he had been wanting to say those words for years. Martha called again Saturday morning. She told me the family was having Christmas dinner at her house this year, and that everyone would be there except for me unless I stopped this madness. She said I was choosing Scott over her and that she was choosing Lisa over my wounded pride. Sunday night, alone in my house decorated with Eleanor's ornaments, I pulled out James Connor's detective report, 11 pages of Scott's financial deception, his gambling addiction, his secret debt, and his plans for bankruptcy that would destroy Lisa's credit and Emma's college fund. The family thought they knew the full story. They had made Scott into a victim and me into a villain based on incomplete information. Christmas was 4 days away. It was time for them to learn the truth about the man they were defending. I reached for my phone and dialed Martha's number. I told her I had a change of plans and that I would be coming to Christmas dinner after all, and that I was bringing some documents that might interest everyone. December 26th brought vindication in the form of Michael's phone call. He said the court had expedited our hearing to January 15th and that Judge Morrison had reviewed the preliminary documents and had found no complexity in the case. I sat back in my leather chair, watching snow fall outside my study window. I asked him if it was because Scott had no legal standing. He confirmed that was exactly the case and that co-ownership was clearly established, that the debt obligations were documented, and that the default was uncontested. He said it should be straightforward. January 15th arrived, gray and cold. The Spokane County Courthouse felt appropriately solemn as Michael and I presented our case. Scott sat across the courtroom with a public defender who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. Judge Morrison reviewed our documents with methodical precision. Property deeds, mortgage agreements, 12 years of payment records, and bank statements showing Scott's financial irresponsibility. Finally, the judge looked up and asked Scott if he disputed my co-ownership of the property at 1247 Miller Avenue. Scott's voice was barely audible as he said no. The judge asked him if he disputed his obligation to satisfy the outstanding debt of $34,000. He again said no. The judge then ordered the immediate satisfaction of the said debt or the forfeiture of property rights. He told Scott he had 30 days to vacate. 3 weeks later, I drove past Miller Avenue and saw the sheriff's cars in Scott's driveway, moving trucks loading furniture while deputies supervised the eviction. Scott carried boxes to his Honda with the mechanical movements of a broken man. Lisa stood on the front porch holding Emma's hand, both of them crying. That evening, my phone rang. Lisa's voice was small and uncertain as she said my name. She said she had been reading through the court documents and all of the financial records. She said she had had no idea that I had supported them for 12 years, that I had paid for everything, including the house down payment, Scott's car repairs, her surgery, and Emma's school clothes. She said she had thought I was just being cruel because my feelings were hurt, and now she understood that Scott and her had been living off my generosity the entire time, and that they had never actually owned that house and that without me they would have lost everything years ago. The silence stretched between us like a bridge being built one word at a time. She apologized for choosing Scott over me and admitted she had been wrong. She said I was not being vindictive and that I was just stopping the help they had taken for granted. I asked her where they were living now. She said they had a small 2-bedroom apartment on the south side and that it was all they could afford on her boutique salary. She said that Scott was broken, that he just sat in that apartment staring at the walls, and that she did not think he ever understood how much they had depended on me until it was all gone. I looked at Eleanor's photograph on my desk, remembering how she had always believed that truth had a way of revealing itself when people were ready to see it. I told Lisa there was something else she needed to know about Scott, something that explained why his financial situation was even worse than she had realized. She asked me what I meant, and I told her to come to dinner Sunday with just Emma, because there was one more document she needed to see. Sunday afternoon, Lisa arrived at my front door with Emma's small hand in hers. My granddaughter had grown taller in the months since I had seen her, her brown curls now reaching her shoulders just like Eleanor's had when we first met. Lisa thanked me for letting them come, and we sat in the living room where Eleanor's piano still held family photographs from happier times. Emma played quietly with her coloring books while Lisa and I talked like adults for the first time in years. She said she had had 2 months to think about everything, including the court documents, the financial records, and all those years I had supported them without them even realizing it. She admitted that Scott had been wrong to call me worthless trash and that she had been wrong to support him against me. She reiterated that I had not been vindictive, but that I was just stopping the help they had taken for granted. She said that now she understood that respect had to be mutual and that family did not mean that Scott could insult me without consequences. Emma looked up from her coloring and asked why her daddy did not live with them anymore. I gently told her that her daddy had made some poor choices and that sometimes adults had to face the consequences for their actions. After Emma returned to her drawings, I walked to my study and retrieved James Connor's detective report, the same 11 pages that had waited months for the right moment. I returned to the living room and told her there was something else she needed to know about Scott's financial problems. She looked up expectantly. I told her that her husband had a gambling addiction, that he had been gambling online for over 2 years, and that he had $28,000 in losses that were completely hidden from her. Her face went pale. She said that was impossible. I handed her the report. She read about the secret bank account, the multiple gambling websites, and the daily sessions while she had thought he was working late. As she read, her expression shifted from disbelief to horror to something approaching relief. She whispered that this explained everything. The mood swings, the secrecy about money, and the way he had gotten so defensive when she had asked about their finances. She read on and saw that he had been planning to declare bankruptcy and destroy her credit rating to cover his debts. Lisa sat down the report and looked at me with eyes that reminded me so much of Eleanor's. She said that I had known all along, and that I could have told her months ago and ended this quickly. I told her that she needed to learn the truth gradually to understand the full scope of what had happened, and not just react to shocking news. So all of this, the legal action, the business contacts, and forcing him to lose everything, was not just about him calling me worthless trash. It was about teaching both of them that actions have consequences, that respect matters, that financial responsibility matters, and that honesty matters. Emma looked up again. She asked if Mommy and I were friends now. I reached over and smoothed her curls. I told her we were family, and that family forgives each other when they make mistakes. Lisa's eyes filled with tears as she asked if I could forgive her. I told her I already had, but that things would be different now, and that we would rebuild our relationship on mutual respect and honesty. I told her that Scott had learned that calling someone worthless trash carried a very expensive price tag. Through the window, I could see spring arriving in Spokane, with new growth replacing what winter had taken away. Eleanor would have been proud. I had protected our daughter, taught her important lessons, and maintained my dignity throughout the ordeal. Justice had been served with precision and patience. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone face the full consequences of their own choices. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of the story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.